Hello and welcome to the programme. Now, Volodymyr Zelenskyi has sworn the oath of allegiance to the people of Ukraine and has officially become the president. More than 60 foreign delegations attended the inauguration here in Kiev. Now, I'm pleased to say, to talk more about the international reaction on Ukraine's new president, we are joined in the studio today by Julia Osmolovska, an international politics expert and executive director at the Institute of Negotiations. Hello, thank you so much for coming in.
Hello.
So there was the ceremony that was held just at the Rada, but also afterwards at Mariinsky Palace, where all these foreign delegates gathered. So what do you think they were talking about? There's a lot of sort of handshakes and that sort of thing, but what were the main topics, do you think, on the international front?
I think the very philosophy of this day doesn't imply sorrowful and detailed talks between the delegations and the president on particular issues of bilateral agenda. I think the first issue of President Zelensky was to introduce himself and probably to speak broadly of his approaches to foreign politics, to bilateral relations with a particular country. And for the foreign delegations was an opportunity to present themselves and to convey a message from the heads of states or the head of governments that of the countries that they are representing, because the format is quite official, very protocol, doesn't imply lots of detailed talks. And every delegation, when they have bilateral meetings with the president, probably had no more than 20 to 30 minutes for each delegation.
Yeah, so they had lots of time to enjoy the food and that sort of thing.
I don't think. I think they enjoy the food for thought, because they still don't know the precise agenda and approaches of Mr. Zelensky to foreign policy, and this is something which is puzzling a lot of foreign diplomats. And
well, exactly, because Zelensky's team said that 95% of his plan had been finished, but we haven't seen anything at all, really. So I guess that's quite a concern for international partners. Is that a fair statement, do you think?
Yeah, it is, because if you compare the mentality, Ukrainian mentality is more of a mobilized nature. So we are ready at the very last moment. But for the more predictable Western culture, this is very difficult to act in an atmosphere of unpredictability. And this is something which we are facing right now. So for Mr. Zelensky and his team, it would have been much better if he could be more clear and predictable and sound at least understandable for their foreign partners, especially in the Western countries.
Yes, and actually one of the delegations from the US was led by the Secretary of Energy, Rick Perry, and we actually have a soundbite from him now, so we can have a listen.
Yeah.
President Zelensky's speech was very powerful in his imagery about the future of Ukraine. His election was about the people of Ukraine, not him.
So there we go. That was Rick Perry speaking to journalists earlier on. Do you think there's a big difference between what people like Rick Perry are saying and what they're actually thinking? Because you were talking about the nervousness, for example, but in the soundbite, he seemed quite positive. He said that Zelensky was talking about the people, and that's the most important thing, and that sort of thing.
Yeah, he probably seemed quite positive, but he doesn't seem very relaxed. So this is, I think, that something still puzzles him. But in particular, speaking about this person, he already had an opportunity to meet Zelensky and his advisors a bit earlier. So at least they had this chance to exchange the views on their possible vision of how they see cooperation with the United States, and especially in energy field. So I think on this issue it's more or less clear. But with regard to relations with Russia, for instance, how do Mr. Zelensky sees an opportunity to overcome the stumbling blocks and deadlocks in negotiations that are happening right now, and where is the role of United States in this pattern? So I think all these issues are still remain open.
Yeah, and I actually read before we started this interview on Interfax Ukraine, one of the news agencies here, that they said that President Putin would in the future perhaps congratulate Zelensky after, I think the wording was, after the first steps of the settlement of the domestic conflict. So already you can see that Russia is not really interested in sort of building relations with Ukraine, because they're saying domestic conflict is not, Russia's war in Ukraine, which is what it is. So what would you make of that sort of statement?
Well, it was not something out of the blue, the Russian position, but they've already expressed the readiness at least to discuss the possible of exchange of imprisoned persons, all for all, as it is stipulated for in Minsk Accords, in Minsk agreements. President Zelensky called for immediate release of all the Ukrainian prisoners which are in Russia. So at least this could be a sort of first possible steps towards each other in order to understand what each party wants out of this. But even given the fact that Russia sees this as internal conflict in Ukraine, nobody could deny that we don't have problems in relations with Russia at all.
Yeah.
So there are conflict relations, and we still need to settle plenty of issues on the agenda, not just limited to what's happening in the east of Ukraine. So the more efficient step would be either from Ukrainian or Russian party, to offer broad-range negotiations on the full set of issues, ranging from energy issues, bilateral trade and economic affairs, investment stuff, the Great Agreement, which was actually dissolved some time ago by Ukrainian parliament.
Yeah.
So all these issues are still should be addressed, at least, by the two sides.
And over the next year, I know it's difficult to predict the next week, but let alone the next year, but do you think that the priorities of Ukraine's international partners in terms of their hopes and expectations for Ukraine, do you think they will change, or do you think that really Ukraine's path towards European standards, reforms of the SBU and the courts, will these change at all? Will there be more different priorities in your opinion?
I don't think that, I don't expect the priorities to be different, but I foresee the challenges in delivering or getting the targets right. So the question is about tactics. The new president and his team is expected to show the different tactics and how to achieve the stated goals. But the goals of, say, working and rapprochement with NATO, they're still the same. But the tactics is different, so we're not begging for immediate statement of Ukraine's right to become a NATO member, but we are ready to prepare ourselves and to show the readiness, and then put the question in front of the people of Ukraine in the referendum, and then to put forward this issue in front of the heads of NATO members.
Do you think that that sort of referendum could happen within 5 years? Because, for example, the path towards NATO membership is in the Constitution. So, I mean, that's on paper, at least. Whether that will happen or not is a different matter, but it is in the Constitution. So do you think Zelensky might resort to this sort of referendum? And what does he hope to achieve with it?
At least he intends to give more right for the people of Ukraine to take part in political decisions via referendums as such. So he is about to offer the bill on referendums. Therefore, I think when this legislation is in place, and when we still are talking about the actual wish of the whole Ukrainian people, in order not to speculate on the part of Ukraine who wants to become, for Ukraine to become a NATO member, and those who don't want. So then I think that this would be a very fair approach to the issue.
Yeah, and how would you rate the last 5 years of reforms in Ukraine, and, for example, how Ukraine's international partners have seen these reforms? Have they been quite positive? Has the momentum sort of continued up until this point, since Poroshenko took office back in 2014?
Yes, we've heard and seen a lot of comments of our foreign partners, especially from Western countries, at the very last period of presidency of Mr. Poroshenko, and these comments, assessments were quite positive. The problem with all these reforms are of this kind, that they are sort of long-term nature, so they're not showing immediate results, and they're quite painful at the beginning. So I think that Poroshenko taken a big part of this not very pleasant part of reform process, and some of the fruits will be bared sometime in the future. Like, for instance, visa liberalization and visa-free regime with EU. The negotiations on this issue had been started on 2007, and we've just completed this under the presidency of Mr. Poroshenko.
Okay, perfect. Well, we'll just have to see how everything develops. Julia, thanks so much for coming into our studio today.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
Thanks.
That was Julia Osmolovska. She's an international politics expert and executive director at the Institute of Negotiations. Thank you for watching Head to Head, and stay tuned for more here on UATV.